Yeah, good to go.
Yes, it's like, yeah, all right. Dr. Vinu Aluri has a background in electronics and communication engineering, after which she pursued a master's in music engineering technology and a PhD in musicology from the University of Jyväskylä, Finland, and is currently an assistant professor at the Cognitive Sciences Lab at IIIT Hyderabad. She also plays the violin. Her research interests include cognitive science, music information retrieval, neuroimaging, music cognition, cross-cultural
చెప్పుకునేటట్టున్నా వాళ్ళు
studies,
చెప్పినా విన్నారు వాళ్ళు.
mental well-being, and depression. Currently, she's working on projects that examine music listening habits, depression, music representation in the brain, and brain changes in cocaine addiction. Today, she'll talk about music and the brain, implications for learning. Over to you, Ma.
Thanks, Vivek. I can share my screen first. Yes. Okay, maybe let's see. I have to minimize this. Give me a second, please. So, can you see just my presentation, or also do you see it move? Just to clarify once more.
Yeah, it's fine now. Yeah,
Yeah, man, we can see it.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Kavita. And I think it's a fantastic workshop that you organized, and many things to learn. In fact, I've learned a lot getting this presentation together, because this is not directly my area in terms of learning in the brain, but of course I do work with neuroscience and music. So without wasting any more time, let me just dive right into it. So, okay, so when we think about music, I think most people think of it as entertainment, right? So we use it to, it has different kinds of effects on us. And I think that this pandemic has really, to some extent, elevated the importance that music is given, because I think there was a huge surge of music listening on online streaming platforms. So which means that music seems to be somehow, it's sort of a very important component in people's lives for well-being, at least, right? So let's see. So what effect does music actually have on us? So while listening, it can put us in a positive mood. We use it to regulate our own emotions. So it's not just that we want to relax, but maybe we want to have a good cry, and then you just listen to certain music and you let your emotions out. And of course, it can be an absolute, a pleasurable thing, and hence that is going to engage your reward system in the brain, and it can lead to decreased cortisol levels, which is related to, of course, stress, and increase oxytocin and these beta endorphins, these hormones, which are all, as you call, the happy, hormones or chemicals, right? So in addition to that, playing music together has also been shown to improve social bonding, and promote pro-social behavior. So just to give a simple example, that when you are playing an instrument with others or singing with other people, somehow when you have a good time, you tend to develop a certain affinity towards them. It's almost as if you created something which was fun, rewarding, and so that also promotes this sort of bonding, which I think is also important when it comes to children and learning, right? So just imagine if the teacher is teaching using more songs, maybe, and they sing along, maybe that's more fun for them, and as a result, probably their learning may actually be, it might actually affect their learning as well, right? But this sort of bonding, this sense of trust is very important, especially when it comes to teacher and child, right? And that's when they start to trust and listen, and that promotes, at least to some extent, some learning, right? Okay, so when we look at clinical studies, we do find that for pain management, people have found that by playing music that they really like, that people they rely less on opioids. So in other words, they take less medication. And some other studies have shown that, of course, listening to music has been beneficial for people who have anxiety or going through depression. These sorts of, engaging in music at least has shown to reduce depressive symptoms. Well, even if it means, maybe not in the long run that it cures anything, but at least partly when it begins to actually, give these every day, that you have some benefit from that in terms of emotional and well-being, then already that sort of has this accumulated effect. And also in aging, right? So you can imagine that elders also, they go through their own solitude and they can feel lonely, and because of not being able to do much, I think music is a very comforting thing for them to engage with. And also in other conditions, or such as autism or other disabilities or some sort of developmental disorders, it has been shown that music making, right, it has been found to improve social interaction and communication. So there were a surge of studies, right? Before I get to the brain, I just want to talk about general what people know about, so just to warm you up. So there was this, a surge of studies in the late 90s about, this so-called Mozart effect, saying that does music listening actually help improve non-musical abilities, right? So some studies came out. If you listen to Mozart, this composer, for certain times every day, then you might end up, you probably increase your creativity, IQ, so on and so forth. But it does turn out that that's really not the case, because there was another study where this is a huge study. It was done with, I think, by using BBC as, the medium, where around 8,000 children, either they listened to music, among them they were divided into groups, either they listened to music, Mozart's music, or 10 minutes of this combination of, different pop British artists. And then another group of children just were listening to the experimenter talking about the study, right? So 3 conditions. And then they found out that the students, or not students, the children who were listening to this music, which is pop music, which was probably more entertaining for them, probably, that they did better on certain tasks. I think they had origami tasks and some other tasks that they had to do, and it turned out they did better. So in one sense, you can clearly say that there is no merit to the claim of a link between listening to music composed by Mozart to the exclusion of music by other composers. So it's not really about Mozart, but if you really love Mozart, maybe it does have a good effect. But these might be very immediate effects, right? I wouldn't think that they would last lifelong, that you keep listening to Mozart and then you have this lifelong impact. And another study similarly showed in Japanese 5-year-olds that they had Mozart, another composer, 4 groups, right? So one listened to Mozart, the other to another composer, and the other one group listened to children's songs, and the other group sang familiar songs, so songs that they probably like. And the ones who sang familiar songs turned out to be more creative in the task that was given to them after, right? So in one sense, you can say that familiarity and liking really matters, because you can imagine that if you already you like a piece of music, you're familiar with it and you enjoy it, that already puts you in a much better state than if you were stuck at a place where you don't really enjoy the music that you're given, or you're trying to make sense. So somehow this sort of, this brain study also showed that when it's familiar music, that you have regions in the brain which are related to processing reward and emotions, and which are the amygdala, putamen. So these are all part of the limbic system, and also part of the reward system, and also the motor areas, right? The supplementary motor area. So this sort of a network of motor areas, reward areas, all of them somehow get all engaged, and that's why music that you absolutely like and enjoy completely puts your brain in a different state than someone suggesting, okay, this music is good for you, you have to listen to this, right? So there's that familiarity actually matters. Now, when we talk about transfer effects of musical training, so there were many studies now. So let's put the Mozart effect aside, right? I'm talking about training. So in the sense that they take a group of children and they train them maybe for 3 months, 4 months. They give them some sort of musical training and then see how they perform before and after in visuospatial tasks or language related tasks, or how their behavior changes in a social way, and working memory tasks, IQ. So there were several studies that were done. So I'm just trying to give you a glimpse of what a review of all the studies had actually found. So what they do say is that there is evidence, right, of some mild to moderate beneficial effects, right? But then there are some studies which fail to show such immediate effects, because in the studies that they took into account, if they took 5 studies into account that looked just at IQ, maybe 4 studies said yes, there was a slight improvement, and the other one said no, right? So it's some mixed results as well, as they call it. Why would you get these kinds of mixed results? Because one thing you have to keep in mind are that people do these kinds of studies all over the world. So what would probably vary is the duration of instruction. So each study might have engaged students for different durations, maybe for 1 month, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, and then the type of instruction. So what sort of instruction are they giving, right? There's no homogeneity there. Maybe some studies they decide, okay, we'll teach them how to play percussion, these drums and any percussive instrument. Some might decide, okay, we'll teach them singing, or some might decide we'll teach them playing the violin. So that the type of instruction, right? Is it a group class, one-on-one class? All these things vary. And also the sample size and heterogeneity, right? So because these are sort of longitudinal studies in the sense that they're not too long, but you have to follow them for 5 months or 6 months. Sometimes students might just drop out of the study saying that, okay, the child cannot take part in this experiment ongoing, these music classes anymore. So, so there would be attrition as well. So there won't be this sort of homogeneity there either. And then there would be dropouts. And hence that might potentially cause some results to be so mild that they don't appear significant. But at the same time, irrespective of all these problems with such kind of studies, that it is still remarkable to see that at least there is some change in these sorts of skills, right? When they train, when they get some form of musical activity and training. But then the important question is how long also is long, right? So how long do you give them some training so that the effects are not just immediate and they wane away after, let's say, a few months, but they're more long lasting, and that maybe there's some sort of rewiring that has happened in the brain, right? Something has changed about the way they function, and then you see those long lasting effects. So there was one study, it was a big study where they followed the students for about 3.5 years. And this was a Chinese study where they had 250 students, right? So they were about 6 years old. So 45 minutes per week, they received musical training in school. And after 3.5 years, they observed that their skills, in terms of what they had improved. And what was found was that they did well in many, almost like there was a slight increase in several domains like math, and math and of course language turned out to be the most significant sort of improvement that they had. In fact, they because these were all Chinese children, they were the ones who received musical training acquired English much faster, right? So for them, English was a second language, right? So when you're trying to think about acquiring a second language, then it appeared that the ones who received musical training acquired that much faster than the ones that didn't. And in fact, there was another study that came about, I think, 3 years ago, saying that there was a school in UK where I think there were these students who were partly from the refugee population or some sort of marginalized population, and they were trying to get them to improve school results. So this teacher introduced this Kodali method, 6 hours a week, where it is a way of teaching music, but there's a lot of hand gestures and movement, right? So there's a lot of motor actions involved, and of course there's the auditory input as well. So this sort of Kodali method of teaching, it turned out that they did extremely well. They improved their reading and writing skills, and they improved their math skills as well. Of course, it's not just to say that, okay, it's just by having fun with music that these things magically appear. But I think when you start to, this whole idea of using your auditory modality and your motor skills, and to combine both of them, to focus and to do that repeatedly, already there's some sort of discipline that is instilled in children. So in that sense, if you think about it, it's it's not surprising that they probably would perform better in certain tasks, right? Okay, so these are just some studies that say that yes, there are benefits, right, to this. Now, but what is actually happening in the brain, right? Why should music be so special? Why not some other stimulus or some other activity? What is actually happening? So when we listen to music, sound or music, so essentially the only thing that comes to your eardrum is just changes in the pressure around, right? Air pressure. So assume that there's a band playing and you have all this sound all mixed up, and coming in as just changes in air pressure, right? And it hits your eardrum, and then, it sends the message to the brain, and then all sorts of processing happens. So what is actually, happening in the brain then? So first of all, there's several elements in music, right? You have several things that you need to automatically, or you automatically do pick up. It becomes a very natural thing to do, that you start identifying, okay, what is that, a female voice? Is it a male voice? Is it a piano, violin, sitar, tabla? You identify the instruments, which is what timbre means. You identify the pitch. So, okay, how's the pitch actually, is it high, low? So some sort of idea about the frequency content. And then we have harmonics, which is essentially, when we hear sound, it is not just one pitch that we get, but also the harmonics. So these are just multiples of that pitch that exist in the sound. So these are all the nuances which actually correlate with timbre. So if I play a piano and violin, I play the same note, but I know that it's a violin or a piano because that's based on the harmonic structure, right? Because there's something else that it is producing which distinguishes it from each other. So call it like a way to identify the instrument or the color of the sound. And then the intensity, which is related to loudness, right? So when something gets louder, you pay more attention to it. Something is softer, then it just goes into the background. So all these come in together, and then timing is very crucial, right? Because you are first of all separating all of these into parallel streams, and then you have to put them back together, right? So the brain, that's what it's trying to do. It's like process all of these parallelly, and then it tries to integrate them to create this sort of higher sense of melody, rhythm, harmony, key, and then that leads to some sort of higher order functions where you try to identify who the singer is, maybe identify the genre of music, or it's associated with some memory. So then that evokes certain, visuals in your brain. And then in the end, emotions, right? That then you might simply dislike it, but all of this is already happening there, right? So you can imagine that we do it so automatically, we don't have to have specific training for that. So it's a very, very fun exercise for the brain, and these things happen so quickly. And as you see, I mean, this is just a rough, description, because it's when we listen to music, large scale networks are sort of they come into picture, they get activated while you're listening to music. So exactly what I said, the sensory element, the syntactical element, this temporal aspect where you attend to certain things, the memories, association, semantics, and you automatically start parsing the temporal structure to get the sense of rhythm. Sometimes you're trained to it, because just imagine if let's say you're on the treadmill and you're listening to the song, or you're walking even and you're listening to music, you start to walk at the rhythm of the music sometimes. It's almost as if it's very natural. We naturally entrained to music, external musical rhythm. And then there's the emotions aspects, right? So much is happening in your brain while listening to music. And that's why it's a very sort of multimodal, network sort of endeavor that, music sort of, that it is. So in one sense, you can say it's a way to exercise the brain, right? But then when it comes to playing an instrument, right, as if listening was not enough, that you're doing all this, while playing, then you start engaging more things, right? So first you have to start paying attention to what you are playing, and then try to parse, okay, so how many, this is just an example with the piano, but it holds good for any other instrument. You have to attend to what you're playing. So there is this element of working memory that comes in, right? So what did I play? What am I going to play next? So there is that planning that goes on, some sort of prediction of, okay, I have to do this and that, and this is how my hand is going to move. And it happens in a split second. And then you have to synchronize everything, right? Because let's say that you hit the wrong note, or you're off, one hand is off, and in terms of time, you somehow have to adapt and then finally synchronize. And then when it comes to actually playing with another individual, then you can only imagine, the level of complexity that goes into actually doing all this for yourself and for the other person. And in the end, it is also about communication, right? Because you are trying to listen to what the other person is saying, and you correct yourself, or somehow try and adapt your playing to that person. So there is this whole thing of communication that comes in. So you can think about it as a very a process which is extremely sort of it really puts your brain on high alert. There are multiple things happening, especially when you're playing an instrument, right? And with another person. So let's get into so what is what's actually the effect of music on the brain. So when we start talking about the brain, I have to make a distinction first between brain structure and brain function, right? So when we think of brain, right, so this is a good analogy to give. From borrowed it from my friend. So it's like this. If the brain structure is all about the roads, right? It's connecting different areas or different regions in the brain. And function is the flow of information or traffic, right? So in one sense, if you think about it, brain, sorry. So brain structure is like the hardware, right? What you have. And then brain functioning is how all of those communicate with each other. So first, let's look at just in terms of not musical training, but engaging in music, either in later life or, how, what sort of effects it has on how it changes how your brain functions, or maybe even micro changes in the structure. So just to give you some examples. So there was a study, I think in 2008, it came out about stroke, right? So when people get a stroke, and then the first few months, they literally just have to, they're in the hospital. They don't get too many people coming in and visiting them. They have to rest, they have to recover. So they did a study where they had people just listening to their favorite music or an audiobook, or, well, then there was a control group which had no other special intervention, right? The group that were listening to music, they recovered faster. And similarly, if you look at the one right below, the melodic intonation therapy for speech recovery. So stroke also sometimes leads to some sort of speech paralysis, or speech. Speech is a bit compromised there because of where the stroke is and whether it's disrupting some of the brain circuitry, right? So typically, it's in an area where at least it's more likely. So at least this is what doctors have told me. Maybe it's true, maybe not, but it tends to occur more in certain parts of the brain. So anyway, but and that might cause some sort of speech disruptions because it's connecting those areas which are related to language uh, uh, production and comprehension as well. So this sort of melodic intonation therapy is where they teach them how to sing rather than speak. So if I have to teach them how to pronounce what's for dinner, they say what's for dinner, or something where it is, there is a melody involved in it, and that somehow surprisingly they're able to sing it but not necessarily speak it. And that's probably because of how if there's a stroke in one hemisphere, it's probably the other hemispheric counterpart which is related to speech, which is probably taking over, right? But this is, in fact, you can look it up, you'll find melodic intonation therapy. And then there's gait in Parkinson's. So people who are Parkinson's, they have their timing and movement related patterns are a bit compromised, and they tend to shuffle when they're walking, and it's not really regular sometimes. So when they listen to music and there's an external beat, since our natural tendency is to entrain to the beat, that's what happens, that it sort of makes them a bit more I would say bit more periodic in terms of their movements, right? And this music improvisational therapy is also related to stroke, which is when you have like a lot of patients go through physiotherapy because there is again some sort of partial paralysis or something that they have to regain that motor control, and physiotherapy is usually done. But then there's a lot of music therapy where they actually start making sounds. So in fact, there is one where there's a drum kit where they're asked to play red, green, blue. So they're color coded. So it's almost like a game for them. And it turns out that, that sort of engages the reward system as well, and the motivation. And then of course, that is key for recovery, right? So that's also one, very it's been going on for many years already. And then there is also in dementia that people have problems with processing memory and all, right? So what does happen is that when music is played, it's quite fascinating that suddenly they become all lucid, that they talk about certain time of their life, maybe when the music was played, and then it kind of helps in recalling some sort of autobiographies, right? Something about your own memories when you were younger, and so somehow that the memory part of it is I don't know how music helps to tune into that, But there is this power of music that actually allows you to recall that aspect, because I guess it's not that memory is stored in one place, but this musical memory is sort of a wide network, right? Because we already know that the brain has a wide representation when it comes to music. So I guess that's what it sort of taps into to pull out that memory, probably. And also there is this mnemonic efficacy of how they say that people with Alzheimer's, again, they have problems remembering things, right? So short-term memory is extremely compromised. But when they are, taught things in a melodic pattern or somehow with music involved, they seem to hold on to it a bit better. Okay. So all these examples that I've given you, these are again small. This is nothing to do with musical training, but all how small changes might happen in how your brain would function, and that is what music is trying to do over there. But now let's get into musical training, right? So how does it affect structure and function? So we'll start with with brain structure. So there were several studies that said that there is increased gray and white matter volume in brain areas that are associated with auditory, motor, and cognitive skills. So just to give you a rough idea, this was one of the earlier studies, and they found those areas which are related to movement and touch, which is the motor and somatosensory, and some parietal areas, and then some parts of the temporal lobe, which is where your auditory cortices are, right? And some parts of the frontal areas which are involved in reasoning, decision making, these sort of cognitive skills, higher order cognitive skills, and parts of the cerebellum. So they found that there's already increased volume. So when we say gray and white matter, you have greater number of neurons. You might have greater white matter is again the axon. So this is where it's like the wires, right? So the wires become more thicker, which means there's a faster flow of information, right? So this is what happens. Like somehow your brain becomes more efficient in transferring information among itself, at least in certain areas. So just to give you another example, so they were this study where they looked at how 2 years of training, what changes did it do for a child who's 8 years old, right? And one child had no training, and the other had string or violin training. And then you notice this AF that is written is the arcuate fasciculus, which is what connects your language production and comprehension areas. And it's a very thick bundle and very long bundle in your brain, like axon bundle. So you see that after 2 years, at there has been a substantial increase in the child's, arcuate fasciculus volume or the density of the fibers, right? So you can clearly see that, okay, something, just for 2 years of training, it has really significantly changed in its size. And if you look at 65, this is a comparison between a 60 plus, musician and non-musician of the same bundles. And you can clearly see that somehow this sort of, structural changes, they last, and they, with time, they seem to become, more and more myelinated and thicker. And finally, that probably helps in building some sort of cognitive reserve, as you will see in some of my upcoming slides. And then there is also this other, it looks almost like a cauliflower, but essentially it's two halves of your brain, and then it's connected by what you would call the corpus callosum, which is like the white matter, which helps in interhemispheric information flow, right? And that's larger in musicians. That's what it was found, especially in the frontal areas or the anterior parts. But then a subsequent study also said, well, it's not just the frontal areas, but depending on how much you practice, different parts of the corpus callosum also have greater volume. And it's dependent on when you start learning, right? So it's not just about blindly starting, but also when you start playing an instrument at a much earlier age, you will see that the brain is more malleable, and hence it develops faster, right? So it becomes a lot more efficient that way. So this study showed that 6-year-olds, right, after 15 months of piano lessons, you could already see that they developed changes in the motor areas. Again, the corpus callosum, this sort of interhemispheric white matter that connects the hemispheres, and also parts of the auditory areas. And very important is that they found, and this seems to be coming up quite often, that before the age of 7 years, that results in greater changes in white matter connectivity, because again, the brain is developing, it's more malleable, and so structurally that's very good time. But then let's see what happens functionally, right? So yes, the hardware is sort of changing, wonderful. Now, how does that actually manifest in terms of how the brain is functioning? So this was by far the biggest study, and it's very recent that it got, I think earlier this year, that they looked at the structural and the functional changes in musicians who had absolute pitch and musicians without absolute pitch and non-musicians. So absolute pitch is something where literally, if I ask you to reproduce the A in the middle of the keyboard, you can play the sound or you can sing the sound because you really know how it sounds. So it's like this absolute pitch where you literally know 440 hertz probably sounds like this, right? So because that is the A on the keyboard, for example. So they found out that at least whether you have absolute pitch or not, it does not matter. But for musicians, there's globally the functional connectivity is ordered, right? How is sort of altered, which means it changes the way your brain is actually functioning overall. It sort of interacts with each other. And there's increased interhemispheric connectivity, right? So both left and right sides of your brain, there's greater connectivity, which makes sense, right? Structurally there is, so functionally also there would be structural changes in the corpus callosum. Again, this white matter, that it connects the bilateral sensory motor brain regions, right? So that is very important. So it's the sensory motor regions which show greater changes there in terms of the connectivity in terms of white matter, and it's also related to age of onset of training. So the earlier they start, the greater the changes there. And very interestingly, it's also, and it's not surprising, at least not to me, but hopefully you'll see the point in the upcoming slides, that the Wernicke's area, which is related to comprehension of language, that shows higher structural and functional interhemispheric connectivity, right? So some of those areas are really, the connectivity has really increased or improved structurally and functionally. But also while listening to music, you do find that there is greater auditory motor interaction. So the auditory regions and the regions responsible, for movement or even touch, that you don't have to move, but even while listening to music and you are a musician, that these regions start getting activated, right? There is increased coupling between them, and not only with them, but also with motor areas and the emotional areas, because somehow constantly when you start rehearsing, when you start playing a musical instrument, the auditory areas, the movement related areas, and the reward areas all tend to, keep, so playing an instrument is associated with all these naturally. So there would obvious connections or crosstalk between them. And there is also some studies which say there is more symmetry, in the sense when I say symmetry, that when I'm listening to music and I'm a musician, that several parts of my brain, right or left, they start getting more, start getting more aligned with each other in one sense, right? So there is that aspect that there is a lot more synchrony within between these regions, sort of the left and right homologs of the brain, right? And we also find in one of the studies that, the motor areas become important hubs while processing music, because yes, auditory areas are hubs while processing music for everyone, but then motor regions become very important, especially those that are related to touch related areas in the brain related to the hands, and the movement related areas in the brain, which sort of are responsible for moving hands and the upper torso. Because if you think about it, when musicians are playing an instrument, it is these are the parts of the body that are sort of more engaged, right? You have your hands and you have the upper torso. This is all that tend to move. So somehow while listening to music, all these get engaged naturally. But what is very important and what I want to get at right now is how musical training improves auditory system precision, right? So making sense of sound, right? This whole thing of how you pass all the information and then put it back together, that's a measure of brain health, right? And Professor Nina Kraus, that's the person you see there, and so they've done extensive work, and I'll be talking more about that work now. So, so how well your auditory system does all this, right? How do you measure that, right? How can I measure that? Because that also probably the more precise your auditory system is, the more precisely you can pass all the information, right? Auditory information, be it speech or music, and hence probably the reward is also greater for that matter, right? So this, they came up with this frequency following response. This was established in 90s or early 80s, I don't remember. But the idea is they give a sound, right, as input, and they use 3 electrodes, and what you measure is like some sort of an average response of the brain. So let's just put it like that, okay, for now, for simplicity's sake. And that is called your frequency following response. All right. Now, and from that frequency following response, you can derive several aspects to see how well the person has encoded the fundamental frequency in terms of the pitch, right? How well is the pitch encoded? How well are they able to capture the timbre of the instrument? Like because you can actually hear this response as well, and it tends to resemble partly what is being heard, right? And it depends on the individual, and so it's very fascinating. If you get your hands on this talk by Professor Nina Kraus, you can hear those examples. It's remarkable that you can hear some, just by this sort of an average brain response, you can hear what was being presented to them partly, right? So what is shown is that for musicians, right, when it comes to processing speech, so they have greater resiliency to degrading effects of background noise. What does that mean? So if you look at the quiet, right, that row, you see that musicians and non-musicians, let's say there's some speeches given to them. In a quiet setting, yes, it seems very similar to each other, the response. But when you incorporate noise, right, you add noise in the background, musicians still are able to pass speech. It's not as accurate. The representation is not as much. So it's not in the sense that maybe they cannot pass that clearly enough, right? And this has been shown in several studies that there are faster and stronger responses to speech and music sounds in musicians, and especially to their own instrument. So if you look at this example here, that the black one is the stimulus that is given. It's one note on the piano. And if you look at the non-pianist response, right, this sort of FFR, this frequency following response, you can clearly see that pianists are a bit more closer to than the non-pianists in terms of the stimulus. And a very interesting study that was done was that they took this response and they played it back to people. So they had different consonants, I think speech syllables and different sounds. And they asked people to actually categorize them, right? So, and it turns out that musicians' responses were much more easily identifiable because they seem to capture more of the properties of the sound. So be it the fundamental frequency, right? But most importantly, the nuances, right? All these additional things which are probably more fine-tuned because of musical training, you start to pick up more of the sound aspects, okay? So in a way, it's like this. If I give you a curry and ask you to tell me what ingredients there are, you can probably tell me, okay, there is turmeric, this, blah, blah, cumin and all of that. But maybe musicians can also tell you how much turmeric, how much cumin. So maybe they have a better, sort of sense of this sharp sort of sense of audition. So now it's not that if you stop, training that this, all these benefits you lose, but even at a later age, right? This is a study done on 60 to 85 years old. You can clearly see in the green bars are the musicians, blue are the non-musicians, and the green bars, their speech and noise perception is better, their auditory working memory is better, and even the musicians with hearing loss, right? That's the green sort of transparent bar. You compare it with the blue, they're even with the hearing loss which comes naturally due to age, all these are still retained, right? Okay, so in one sense you can think of, that lifelong musical expertise seems to reduce, right? It does reduce some cognitive decline. So it builds some form of cognitive reserve. So in one sense, it is like trying to compensate for the natural decay in terms of structure and function that occurs due to aging, right? So I won't go into this due to the lack of time, this figure, but it's still pretty straightforward. But so what does that have to do with learning, right? So now I want to focus on learning. Now, for that, let's just first go to, the Amazonian jungles. But there is this whole thing about learning as a child, that as we just heard from Summer and all the discussion that happened thereof, that most of the learning happens, in terms of language and all of communication, it happens orally, and of course there's visual gestures as well, but I'm focusing on the oral aspects. So let's just look at this. I'll play a short video of the Piraha. These are the Amazonian tribe that people have researched on, and they're quite isolated, right? So yeah, so they have a very interesting form of language. You see that.
It's how they communicate. Piraha can be spoken, hummed, sung, even whistled.
So essentially what they're trying to do is that they have very few syllables, but they have this sort of, it's all sort of a tonal sort of communication, right? So these slight inflections, you're supposed to understand what that person is saying. And that's very crucial for survival, right? Because you don't want to mistake these subtle differences for, if he's trying to warn you that there's a cat or there is a big, a giant cat or a lion or a tiger, right? They need to know. So for that, they need extremely good auditory precision in terms of parsing the sound. Professor Daniel Everett gives a very good example of these. So I hope that, again, it's just a few seconds. I hope you can hear the nuances of the words there.
The language turned out to be one of the most unusual languages anyone has ever studied. It was my privilege to go there. I asked the word for skin and I got awe, and I asked the word for ear and I got awe, and I asked the word for hand and I got awe, and I asked the word for Brazil nut shell and I got awe, and then I asked the word for me and I got che, and I asked the word for dog excrement and I got che.
Okay, so just to, so this sort of extreme precision, right, is very, very key. And musical training definitely has that effect of improving that precision. So, but anyway, we're not living in Amazonia's, forest and all. So why is this even relevant, right? Because we think about language. So this is how, babies and, toddlers, they start to acquire language, right? This sort of baby babbles, baby talk, which even the mother does. So there's no need to form complete words, but they seem to, there is this is how they start to process sounds. They need to know how to parse the sounds. So in one sense, music and language, right, they seem to have very similar properties. So in one sense, both of them require fine discrimination of sounds, right? In this case, I need to know which, pitch is being played. Similarly, you need to know where one sound ends, the other one begins in speech, and they're structured rhythmically over time, right? And you have to parse, you have to sort of integrate information at various levels. So at the phoneme level, the word level, similarly at the note level, at the phrase level, for music, and you integrate them at various levels, right? So it's like you have a word, phrase, sentence, and so on. Same thing with music. You have one bar, then you have a repeating motif and something larger. And then in the end, there is this evaluation of the intonation, which tries to, so for example, if someone says, how are you? Then you have to understand, is it a rising tone, falling tone? Because you need to know, are they asking you a question or are they making a statement? And that's very similar. This is what music also, this is how you pass musical information. And that's why this auditory system precision, how well it does this, can be a biological looking glass into a child's literacy potential, right? So it has been shown that struggling readers have particular problems with auditory temporal processing, right? And rhythmic abilities are linked to early and better reading skills. So the greater your rhythmic abilities as a child, so it was linked to better reading skills. And rhythmic patterns help a listener understand speech better. In fact, when they looked at this FFR in drummers and vocalists and non-musicians, so where they see how well the speech is encoded in your brain when there's background noise, drummers seem to perform better than vocalists than non-musicians, right? And jazz drummers also, they recruit like language specific areas for processing rhythmic structure. And then music making was found to improve, this is important, right? That music making was found to improve communication skills by training aspects of rhythm, because just as I said, the parallels between music and language. And literacy development also proceeded smoothly in children whose oral language problems were resolved by age 5.5 weeks, right? So in the sense, but then there's one issue here. How do you identify, right? The key is, how do you identify if a child may have some issues, or, how do you, is there any way that we can do that? And Nina Kraus and all, they published a very, interesting article where they had a 30-minute assessment where they give the child, because you can't really assess these in, toddlers and all, it's not as straightforward, right? But they've given speech sounds like da, 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 ba. So these sorts of consonants in succession, but there's a lot of chitter chatter behind. So it's as if there's a lot of people talking and there's a lot of noise, and then they see how well that specific consonant, right? These sorts of repeating things are actually being encoded. And what they found was when they checked 3 to 4 years old kids, stronger neural processing emerged to be a predictor of stronger readers after 1 year, right? So if you had stronger, more like higher fidelity representation of that specific consonant sounds in succession, that they ended up being stronger readers. And older children also, they tried to look at older children to see, okay, whether they could actually predict based on how well they reproduce that by means of the brain responses, that which ones have actually received a diagnosis of reading impairment. So that's actually pretty fascinating. And I don't think it has been tried in India, but this might be something interesting to look at. And also, auditory processing differs in children with autism spectrum disorder. I don't want to go into all the plots now because of lack of time, but I do want to make a couple of points. So yes, one thing is that auditory processing stability differs in dyslexic children, right? So especially because dyslexic children, it's related to language and all, that there is some timing and rhythm related problems that they face. And that affects their reading abilities as well. But what was at least one sort of a silver lining was from that research, that 7 months of active music training versus painting as a control, it improved reading skills in children with dyslexia, right? So that because engaging in music seems to improve auditory, precision, which means it was going to show all these effects, which would in the end be beneficial for the child in terms of learning and language acquisition. So there were several of these where, again, they say these longitudinal studies are very difficult to do. But finally, what is said is that 1 year may not be enough, but you need 2 years at least to see that change. Because 1 year maybe it's just a bit temporary, but 2 years it's probably a bit more hardwired into your system, right? So for more information about all these studies, you can check Brain Volts. That's Professor Nina Krause's lab. And I'm almost done with two, 3 slides and I'll be done. So they did these studies where they looked at these sorts of marginalized and communities and gang reduction zones in LA. And so 6 to 9 years old, they put them, it is part of this Harmony project where they all got music instruction as a group, right? So in a way, they were just getting together, making sounds, having fun with that. And of course, there is some rigor that goes into learning it, but doing it as a group. And the other group, so they compared their progress with kids who were on a wait list, right? Who did not get any such additional intervention. So they started with 2 hours per week and they moved it to about at least 4 hours per week, right? After 6 months. So they found that after 1 year, the perception of sentences and noise, right? Which is again related to reading abilities, that seems to have improved. But after 2 years, it was way, way better in terms of how they were able to differentiate syllables. Like when you hear a sound, whether it was a ba or a ga or a da, right? So that was a lot more better, their neural differentiation, and that also improved their reading skills. And they finally, that's what they had also published, that musical training alters brain development, especially in terms of neural encoding of speech in at-risk adolescents. And that's, and sort of saying that it's due to musical training. And the last study that I'm touching upon, this is again in Chicago, where they looked at 14 years old, because 6 to 8 years old is, that's where the brain is a lot more malleable as well. 14, they also thought, okay, let's see what happens when you take a much older age group. And for 4 years, they either got musical training or they got this JROTC training, which is more like a sort of physically intensive, sort of like this cadet training and partly military training, but not as rigorous, but still. So both of these had lots of self-discipline, dedication, and determination that, that all that goes into that. So what did happen is that their response consistency, in the sense, if you see the red lines, you can see that after 4 years, the ones who got musical training, first picture, that how they processed speech and noise, it was pretty much intact. Nothing had degraded when compared to the other group. But the degradation doesn't mean that you don't hear it as much, but it's just that it's not as consistent as it used to be. And for phonological awareness, again, this is again related to, how probably identifying of phonemes and all of that, that both of them also probably improved, which is also expected. But then the music training, the ones who got music training improved a bit more. So in one sense, they say that music training initiated at least, even if it's initiated at least as late as high school, still has a potential to improve sound processing in the brain, right? Which again leads to better literacy and output. So please do check her website. It's absolutely fascinating what they have done, and you can get an overview there. And finally, my key takeaways is that playing music is special in allowing for far transfers. When I say far transfer, it's not within the domain itself, but across domains. So how music can probably help in how musical training can improve auditory precision, then leading to greater language processing or acquisition. So that is like a far transfer effect, right? So start, and then also it is good to start early, and preferably at least 2 hours, 2 to 4 hours per week is already enough. And continuing for 2 years is good because you see that there would be greater changes after 2 years, right? At least from a lot of studies that I've demonstrated now to you, and also from the structural studies, right? 15 months already, or you need that amount of time to see some plasticity happening there in the brain. And musical training for developmental and learning disorders, I think that's a wonderful area to still look into, because I think in terms of autism and dyslexia, and especially autism with cases rising, I think it's important to identify maybe at an early stage, which would probably allow for better sort of intervention to take place and improve their emotional and social skills by means of musical training as well. And you don't have to be a professional musician to reap all these benefits, but the more you play, the more you profit. So, you don't have to, be the next, I don't know who's the current to say who's the next, but you don't have to be the next it person in music. But I think it's really about time that from STEM we sort of move on to incorporate the arts. And please, I really hope policymakers take that seriously enough and incorporate music into the curriculum, because as simple as even 2 to 3 hours a week, right? Preferably a one-on-one training with the kids or as a group, even that is beneficial to start with and start early. So thank you for your attention. And that's my talk.
Thank you, Vinu. Questions, please. You can type on the chat box, or you can unmute and ask the question.
Questions?
Yeah, there was a question on yesterday or day before. There was one on autism. I think you also looked at the chat. One of the participants here was asking what can be done for autistic children. I think some of maybe you can send some resources that we can share with the participants, because that would also help. We are also doing those things. So we can help the children and the teachers, parents too. So there's one question: can we reduce depression using music?
So again, I guess depression, now if you're talking about, again, depression, you have mild, moderate, and severe depression as well, right? So when you are at the state of severe depression, then you suffer from anhedonia, where most likely you will suffer from anhedonia, where you don't derive pleasure out of anything, music included, when it comes to that stage. But I think a lot of research that we're doing, we noticed that music seems to be a coping mechanism, for such individuals who are at risk for depression. They seem to engage a lot with music, which is probably a good thing, right? And to ensure they don't tip over to this sort of severe depression. So I think, so again, it depends where. It's not about reducing depressive symptoms. Maybe it alleviates something, but when you have to identify which group they belong to, mild. So for children having learning disabilities, any solution? So I think that first of all, we need to test. I really think that we should start looking into how auditory system precision is in kids who are having some sort of learning disabilities, right? Because are they suffering from parsing rhythmical elements? Are they suffering from parsing, I mean, depending on the stimulus that is given to them. So is it more how to identify which phonemes, or, this sort of parsing that information? So what is the problem that is happening? And that's one way where you can identify. But then all this research does seem to show again, disabilities is a general word, learning disabilities. So if we can identify this, and I think musical training, the right kind of musical training, if it's dyslexia, maybe more rhythm oriented musical training might help. Or if it is um, if it is something else like an autism, where it is a developmental disorder, that's different, right? They learn other things. Maybe that is slightly compromised, some other aspects. They do very well in other subjects. So it depends on identifying which sort of disability they have. Like Parkinsonianism, holding the pen, getting a grip is also an issue, but that tends to occur much later in life, right? So I think this sort of the therapy that the sort of physiotherapy incorporated with music. I can maybe send some links or guide you to that if you want to write me an email, and I can at least, maybe you can look into that. So several people are doing music therapy and they look into all of this. And even in NIMHANS, there is Dr. Shantla Hegde works on that. She's working.
Hello. Um,
Yeah.
what type of music for all this research they are using?
Sorry?
What type of music? Is it classic or general thing? Like children know
So
generally they like the music. So all the research when we are doing, what type of music they are using?
So it depends on, so if they're trying to assess their how precisely their auditory system is encoding, they give simpler stimulus, right? They give, it's very simple. It's not really like music per se, but if they want to know how the brain is processing, yes, then they give different kinds of musical excerpts. But everything boils down to what question you're asking. So I can give any music, right? But then I see, okay, this is familiar music. Then I see what sort of effect there is, or this is music that they don't like, or this is a completely unfamiliar piece. So it really boils down to the question you're asking, and stimuli are designed according to that. I hope I've answered your question. But at least in musical activities, typically I think they're more Western oriented, but I think there's no, I mean, same thing.
Not connected actually. So
Sorry?
it's not connected actually. You can use any type of music. So the for the research and all. Yeah.
So it depends on what you're asking. So
Yeah.
typically Indian music is not used, of course, right?
Yeah.
Because
Depends
people are,
on what they want to learn. So depending on the researchers. Yeah.
yes, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's one more question. Any studies conducted with Indian music and mantras?
Yeah, this is something that we were planning actually with Dr. Shantla Hegde at NIMHANS with mantras and trying to see the effect, but nothing. I think there was one study about I think a girl who looked at EG responses and I think related to Om, the sound Om and all, but nothing has come out. Nothing has been really published so far. So I think there's a lot of scope to do all of these, and I think there is this. This is something that we were planning to do. Yeah. So that's the answer for that. Then, is there any difference in how music is processed by the brains of people having musical background versus the non-musical ones? Okay, maybe my presentation wasn't clear. I didn't do a good job, but that's what I was trying to talk about. How, when you process music, there's greater auditory motor interaction. There is greater motor and reward interaction. So these regions of the brain sort of function together naturally while processing music. Yeah, in addition to other areas which are processing, like this attentive, these sort of central executive networks, several areas really, but these are the most prominent ones with musical background.
Yeah, just take two more questions. They're there in the chat. How can we integrate music for language development?
So I think that, well, first of all, you need to look at these studies that have identified, like I said, 2 to 4 hours per week of musical engagement. Now we have to decide what sort of musical engagement it is. It could be rhythmic activity, some singing, maybe playing an instrument, so that we can sort of narrow down on. And then once you see that sort of, and then we have to study how, after a certain period, how their language abilities would change, because a lot of research points to that language development is good when you engage in these sort of informal and formal musical activities. So not just listening, but actually playing and singing and all of that. So
Yeah,
that can be.
there's just one last question I think we can take. Some children align with music, but music alone, they don't get tuned towards studies. Then they are good musicians.
I don't now, this is why a person doesn't align towards studies is I think it's a very broad statement, because either they don't find the way the teacher is teaching interesting, or maybe they don't get that way of teaching, or there could be several other factors. So I think children are like sponges. Anything you teach them, they tend to gravitate. But yes, I do understand that some might not like language related things and more math oriented, but that's also individual differences, like or let's say it's about how your cognitive styles of thinking are. So Yeah, I think there's the individual differences and environmental factors. So we can't just say that, yeah, music is just music alone, it's arts and nothing else to do with math and science. Not the case.
I think we'll stop. There's some questions. We'll pass it on to you that you can answer. We have an online source site that we'll put it up. Okay. Mr. Shrikant, you can, I want to just thank Dr. Vinu for her time. It's not easy to take and give talks like this. I know she's a very active person. She does it in the class. So to do it online, but I thank you for it. And I thank all the people here, but please don't leave. Just wait for 10 minutes. We'll just summarize all the talks.